it only remains for me to say how delighted I am to have back Robert Pirrie on his annual lecture for us. Robert is, as I'm sure many of you know, had a storied career in the law. He then decided to add another string to his already amply strung bow by becoming a historian. He studied with the Open University for his history masters, and then with King's College for his PhD, and is now a research fellow at King's College London. So he has the accolades and he's fully garlanded, let us say. Tonight, he is going to talk to us about probably the most famous Victorian historian, Thomas Babington Macaulay, and how he may have misinterpreted or misrepresented some of the niceties, some of the niceties isn't the right word, is it? No, some of the peculiarities, let's say, of Scottish history. But I am going to leave it to Robert now to explode the myths that have been unwittingly created by this Victorian monster, and give us a far more accurate picture of the course of Scottish history. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. I was so embarrassed at one point there, I was thinking of turning my camera off when you were referring to me as garlanded. But I will now share my screen with you. Hopefully that will all be fine. Well, tonight I'll be talking about the splendidly named Victorian historian Thomas Babington Macaulay. Lord Macaulay of Rothley in the county of Leicester, as he became. Macaulay's history of England influenced many people who helped to shape modern society, from Winston Churchill to Sigmund Freud. Most of you will have heard of him. Don't worry if you haven't. I'm going to assume that not many of you have read all 5 volumes of his magnum opus, The History of England from the Accession of James II. You can correct me later if you have read it. Published between 1848 and 1855, few middle and upper class British homes in the Victorian and Edwardian eras would be without a Macaulay. His was the prototypical Whig interpretation of history, the idea of history as progress, under a beneficent and specifically English constitution. Could this be why Karl Marx called Macaulay a falsifier of history? Why does this matter? Well, because Macaulay casts a long shadow over British history writing. He might even have some responsibility for the habit, sometimes heard south of the border, of referring to England when what is meant is Britain or the United Kingdom. This evening, I'll be looking at his attitudes and influence in my specialist area, Scottish history. Although Macaulay wrote the history of England, he was in fact, as his surname suggests, half Scottish. Yet for a variety of reasons, he seems to have distanced himself from this part of his identity, and as we shall see, demonstrated a fairly impressive and colourful hostility to any romantic ideas of Scotland as a nation, and Highland culture in particular. Quote, "An uncivilized nation with no love for their country or for their king." I first became interested in the impact of Macaulay on Scottish national identity during my research for my PhD. Modern academic historians often quote Macaulay on Scotland. I think this is because his prose is so enjoyable, often hyperbolic, and often very funny. It has a way of leaving a lingering impression. It's problematic, though, of course, to treat a sweeping opinion written in the 1840s as historical evidence of people's behaviour and beliefs in the Scottish Highlands. I'm now working on a book about Scottish national identity. My goal is to give readers a brief and, I hope, entertaining history of how Scottish national identity developed in the crucial years of the 17th and 18th centuries, and to link this to recognisable aspects of Scottish national identity in the modern age. For many people today, both inside and outside Scotland, national identity is a political issue. I take a different perspective. For much of the key period, most people in Scotland, as in England, did not have a vote. There are deeper currents in the evolution of Scottish identity. Monarchy, law, religion, war, literature, clan, and family being the main ones. If we are not aware of the shared history of the generations of people who came before, we cannot truly understand our world and who we are. If you pick up a book covering Scottish cultural history, you will see certain themes recurring. I argue most of these can be traced back to Macaulay. In my view, Macaulay paved the way for what I'll call the invention interpretation of Scottish history. Labels like invention can be very helpful. Labels can communicate theory, but we have to be wary of labels when they become reductive of the immense, unknowable complexity of people, places, and events over time. Macaulay is wonderfully entertaining and engaging as a writer, and I enjoy reading his work. I even smile when he describes a Highlander like this, quote, "When the English condescended to think of him at all, and it was seldom that they did so, they considered him a filthy, abject savage, a slave, a papist, a cutthroat, and a thief." Macaulay argued that post-Culloden in 1746, a new attitude to Highlanders began to emerge, and these, quote, "hateful vermin" were, quote, "exalted into a hero of romance." Macaulay said a version of the Highlands was created by writers like Walter Scott that, quote, "superseded history," and, quote, "the visions of the poet were realities to his readers." This argument was taken up by modern historians, notably Hugh Trevor Roper. Trevor Roper, who admired and emulated Macaulay, wrote the introduction to the Penguin edition of Macaulay's history. He was also the author of a chapter entitled "The Invention of Tradition, the Highland Tradition of Scotland," in Hobsbawm and Ranger's seminal work, The Invention of Tradition. Of course, there is excellent academic work on Scottish cultural history, and many Scottish historians would dismiss Macaulay and Trevor Roper's invention of Scotland argument as outdated, discredited even. Yet the invention stereotype survives. Even really excellent texts with much new research on, for instance, the long history of tartan and Highland dress will still cite Trevor Roper and reinforce this invention trope. Recent books promise to present new assessments on the Romantic movement or antiquarianism, and yet the same phrases are returned to again and again. Just as Macaulay influenced generations of historians, Trevor Roper, whose style owes much to Macaulay, continues to have an effect on perceptions of Scottish cultural history. The effect is trivialising and results in catchphrases like "the tartan monster" and "the tartan terror." And incidentally, these are terms favoured by Scottish writers, keen to disown a subject seemingly bound up with naff modern-day souvenirs. I could spend a great deal of time tonight quoting Macaulay on Scotland for the whole of this talk, but I will try and restrain myself. In one respect, it's been argued he was the first to put Scotland in its proper place within the history of Great Britain. It could equally be argued with the same force that he's responsible for the episodic approach to Scotland in histories of Great Britain. What gets lost is the sense of the long evolution of the recurring forces driving these episodes. Macaulay's writing combined two crucial elements: literary style and substantive research. The problem arises when hyperbolic prose coincides with allegedly indisputable fact derived from his research. Most perilously of all for the reader is acceptance of Macaulay's reliability as authoritative when writing about Highlanders, based on the reader's knowledge that Macaulay himself came from a Highland family. Thus, readers of Trevor Roper's Invention of Scotland are told, quote, Macaulay had some special qualifications for writing about Highland history. He was himself, by origin, a Highlander. These Highland origins came from Macaulay's father, Zachary. One of a family of 12 children, Zachary was born in Inverera in the Scottish Highlands in 1768. This, you can see on the slide, is his memorial in Westminster Abbey. Zachary's family story is a classic Scottish lad o' pair's tale, seeing him and several of his brothers take up positions across the outposts of empire. Zachary left the Highlands aged 16, going first to Glasgow, where he proceeded to conform to every Glasgow stereotype, getting in with a bad crowd and overindulging in alcohol. He emigrated to Jamaica and worked as an assistant manager on a slave plantation, where, as an intelligent and sensitive young man, he became appalled and sickened by plantation life. Macaulay women were formidable, and Zachary's sister was a key player in the family's destiny. Jean Macaulay married Thomas Babington, a wealthy evangelical abolitionist in Leicestershire, whose circle included William Wilberforce. When Zachary returned to England from Jamaica in 1789, he was influenced by this connection to cure his alcohol habit and campaign as an abolitionist. In 1799, he married Selina Mills, a schoolteacher, and the first of their 9 children was born in 1800. The boy was given the forenames Thomas Babington, after Zachary's brother-in-law. Throughout his life, Thomas was to be closer to the women in his family and had a difficult relationship with his father, Zachary. Perhaps this lack of emotional rapport with his father affected how he felt about the history of the clan that gave him his Highland surname. The Macaulay clan hailed from Uig on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. Zachary's father, John Macaulay, was a minister of the Church of Scotland and a grandson of the most legendary clan chief of the Macaulays, Donald Cam. In the very best Hebridean traditions, the Macaulays enjoyed an interminable, deadly feud with the neighbouring Morrison clan. Donald Cam's fame rested on his exploits as a mercenary in Ireland and his wholehearted enthusiasm for violent revenge on the Morrisons. Stories of losing an eye in an attack with a red-hot poker or setting villages on fire are legion in accounts of his life. It brings to mind Thomas Babington Macaulay's suspicion of the folk history of the Highlands. Quote, men relate boastfully how they or their fathers had wreaked on hereditary enemies in a neighbouring valley such vengeance as would have made old soldiers of the 30 Years' War shudder. Zachary's mother was Margaret Campbell, Campbell being the clan name of the great Scottish magnates, the Earls and Dukes of Argyll. When Zachary was born, Inverera was being constructed as a model town, with a neoclassical courtroom, church, townhouse, and a new ducal castle, a model of Enlightenment Scotland in the remote Western Highlands. Thomas Babington Macaulay grew up in very different circumstances to the world of his father. Thomas was educated entirely in England, first at a private school in Hertfordshire and then at Trinity College, Cambridge. From an early age, his family circle considered him a prodigy, and he won several prizes whilst at Trinity. His father wanted him to study mathematics, but Thomas was more interested in writing and in becoming a politician. He quickly became immersed in literary work and political connections. And those connections resulted in critics referring to him as Lucky Tom. Perhaps the most controversial part of Macaulay's career stems from his time when he served in England as the law member on the Supreme Council as part of the Whig administration between 1834 and 1838. Macaulay on India would be a whole lecture in itself, but suffice it to say that his Minute on Indian Education of 1835 asserted the supremacy of Western culture and Western institutional education. On returning from India, he was twice MP for Edinburgh from 1839 to 1847 and again from 1852 to 1856. Colonial mentality is relevant when considering Macaulay's attitudes to Scotland and the Highlands, because nothing seems to have enraged him more than the romance of Scotland's past or an elevation of Highland culture. Despite these attitudes, when it came to his ambition to write a history of England, it was three Scots who exerted the greatest influence on Macaulay: David Hume, Sir Walter Scott, and Sir James Mackintosh. Remembered today as the great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, David Hume was also the author of a best-selling history, very deliberately entitled The History of England, in 6 volumes, published between 1754 and 1762. Macaulay wanted to write a work of similar sweep for the 19th century. It was equally important to Macaulay to write history in a literary style as engaging as that of Walter Scott, the most popular literary figure of the early 19th century. Despite his name now being so frequently linked with invention in relation to Scotland, Scott was never cavalier when it came to history. Macaulay himself believed that, quote, "the history of England is emphatically the history of progress," and was therefore uneasy when he felt novels like Scott's Waverley caused readers to romanticize a primitive and violent past. However, Macaulay believed that historians should appeal to the imagination of readers, as Scott did, and make the past present. Call up our ancestors before us with all their peculiarities of language, manners, and garb. The third Scot was James Mackintosh, a born Highlander, whose parents were both of ancient Highland families. After Mackintosh's death in 1832, Macaulay benefited immensely by being given the papers which this son of the Highlands had researched for his own unfinished History of the Revolution of 1688. So, from Hume, Macaulay derived ambition to write a history of England. From Scott, he derived literary style. And from Mackintosh, he acquired original research. A reviewer in The Guardian in 2012, whilst acknowledging Macaulay's problems for a modern historian, also celebrated his, quote, "literary gifts, glorious cadences and verbal seductions." Indeed, the same reviewer notes Macaulay's influence living on within history shelves of today's high street bookshops. It's now time for some vintage Macaulay. When Macaulay talks about Scottish culture, he dwells on the Highlands and Highlanders. The 17th century Highlands was, quote, "an uncivilized nation. Robbery was held to be a calling, not merely innocent, but honourable. There was, quote, a dislike of steady industry, and that disposition to throw on the weaker sex the heaviest part of manual labour, which are characteristic of savages. Macaulay asked his readers to imagine the reaction of an observer from England. Quote, "He would be struck by the spectacle of athletic men basking in the sun, angling for salmon, or taking aim at grouse, while their aged mothers, their pregnant wives, their tender daughters were reaping the scanty harvest of oats. Nor did the women repine at their hard lot. In their view, it was quite fit that a man, especially if he assumed the aristocratic title of Duriwassel and adorned his bonnet with the eagle's feather, should take his ease, except when he was fighting, hunting, or marauding. To mention the name of such a man in connection with commerce or with any mechanical art was an insult. A high-born warrior was more becomingly employed in plundering the land of others than in tilling his own." Macaulay was, of course, writing this assessment when, as he was painfully aware, readers had a far more positive view of the Highlands and ancient Gaelic culture, epitomised by the elusive, shall we say, Gaelic poet Ossian. He had to explain Victorian perceptions being so at odds with reality as he would present it. This he blamed on the emotional effects of Bonnie Prince Charlie's defeat in 1746, when, quote, "the Highlands were subjugated rapidly, completely, and forever." According to Macaulay, quote, "the sight of tartan inflamed the populace of London with hatred, and yet no sooner had the Highlanders been defeated did they become to the Saxons," and by Saxons he meant not just the English, but also Lowland Scots, quote, "objects of curiosity, of interest, even of admiration." He linked this explicitly to tartan and Highland dress. Quote, "As long as the Gallic dress was worn, the Saxons had pronounced it hideous, ridiculous, nay, grossly indecent. Soon after it had been prohibited, they discovered it was the most graceful drapery in Europe. Soon the vulgar imagination was so completely occupied by plaids, targes, and claymores that by most Englishmen, Scotchman, and Highlander were regarded as synonymous words. Few people seem to be aware that at no remote period a MacDonald or a MacGregor in his tartan was to us citizens of Edinburgh or Glasgow what an Indian hunter in his war paint is to an inhabitant of Philadelphia or Boston." Macaulay concluded with the memorable phrase that before the Romantic era, it was viewed by 9 out of 10 Scotsmen as the dress of a thief. Now, that phrase is quoted by Scotland's preeminent historian, Sir Tom Devine, in his best-selling Modern History of Scotland. Macaulay asserted a similar change in attitude had taken place in respect of the landscape of the Highlands. What was once considered, quote, "a hideous wilderness that excited, quote, no feeling but contempt and loathing, now attracts, quote, thousands of clerks and milliners who are thrown into raptures by the sight of Loch Katrine." Now, you might say, what does it matter if that is what Macaulay said? But I cannot tell you how often you will see some of this quoted, often directly, or disseminated or footnoted, even in modern histories. By the 1980s, Macaulay was still being praised for, quote, and this is from a Scottish historian, "a prodigious amount of research," and for the fact that he was, quote, "never guilty of suppressing or distorting evidence to make it support a proposition." Now, Macaulay, of course, carried out considerable research and looked at primary sources, and these are cited in some of his footnotes. One of these is a work entitled "A Journey Through Scotland in Familiar Letters from a Gentleman" by John Mackay, collected and published in 1723. Macaulay describes A Journey Through Scotland as a work, quote, which professed to give a most exact account of Scotland, and in this work, consisting of more than 300 pages, 2 contemptuous paragraphs were thought sufficient for the Highlands and Highlanders. While the old Gallic institutions were in full vigour, no account of them was given by any observer qualified to judge of them fairly. Well, clearly I had to take a deep dive into A Journey Through Scotland. And yes, in the index, only 3 pages are mentioned under the words Highland and Highlanders. But lo and behold, when you actually read the work, there are frequent passages referring to the Highlands and Highlanders throughout. The author John Mackie was born in Scotland and by the 1690s worked as a spy for the British government, who sent him to France to gather intelligence in Europe. In England, he was familiar with all the leading figures of the day, thanks to his presence in the court of William and Mary. And politically, he was aligned with the Whig faction. In contrast to Macaulay's assertions that before the Romantic poets, no one found the Highlands beautiful, Mackie called Morayshire, quote, one of the beautifulest countries I have seen in Britain. He found Elgin to be, quote, the Richmond of Scotland, and Inverness, quote, a pretty town. They speak as good English here as London. Now, in case you were thinking, well, that's just one book and it was written by a Scot, another, even earlier work demonstrates these were not unique sensibilities. First published in London in 1693, Theatrium Scotiae was a celebration of Highland scenery, history and commerce in a mixture of text and 57 remarkable plates featuring views of the country. And 2 splendid editions of that work are in the collection at the Signet Library, in the collections at the Signet Library. The interest and veneration demonstrated for Scottish history is notable in this work because the author, John Slezer, was born in German-speaking Europe around 1650, long before, as Macaulay would have us believe, such antiquarian enthusiasms became fashionable. Amongst the Highland places depicted are Dunkeld, as you can see in this print. And Fortrose and Elgin are both featured and described as picturesque. Accompanying the images in Theatrium Scotiae is a descriptive text. These descriptions praise the natural settings and landscapes of the towns, discuss trade and industry, local landowners, and aristocrats, and noble historic buildings and relics, notable historic buildings and relics. This is at odds with Macaulay's claim that before the late 18th century, quote, none of these sites had power to attract a single poet or painter. I mentioned earlier that Highland places and Highlanders feature throughout Mackie's A Journey Through Scotland, despite Macaulay's claims that these are limited to, quote, 2 contemptuous paragraphs. A good example of Mackie's interest is a fairly lengthy description of an agricultural Highland fair at Crieff, a market town in the Southern Highlands. As well as a fascinating account of new trade with England enabled by the recent Act of Union, it also gives an excellent picture of the subtle distinction of Highland dress between the different classes attending the fair. This very description disproves Macaulay's claim that such sartorial matters attracted no curiosity before the Romantics came along. Mackie finds Highland gentlemen, quote, mighty civil, dressed in waistcoats and trousers, which is, and this is a quote, breeches and stockings of one piece of striped stuff, with a plaid for a coat and a blue bonnet. Amongst their accoutrements, Mackie noted their pistol, with a great broadsword by their side. Quote, their attendants were very numerous, all in belted plaids, girt like women's petticoats, down to the knee, their thighs and half of the leg all bare. Mackay also disproves another Macaulay claim that tartan was never seen south of the Highlands until it became a fashion statement, since these men, quote, hired themselves out for a shilling a day to drive the cattle to England. It wasn't just in the Victorian era that Highland gentlemen acquired their swagger. Take these two 17th century Highland gents. They're clearly taking the chance to show off every piece of kit that they've got. And again, I stress, 17th century. It's easy to disprove Macaulay's claim that tartan was not seen in Edinburgh. From the highest status people in Scotland, like this member of the Royal Company of Archers, painted in 1715 in Edinburgh's Parliament Square, to the lowliest servant, plaid and the kilt had been a familiar sight in Edinburgh for hundreds of years. Tartan was manufactured all over Scotland. In 1575, the General Assembly in Edinburgh censured ministers, as well as their wives, from wearing tartan plaids and other, quote, sumptuous clothing. In 1604, the wearing of tartan by women was forbidden in the kirks of Glasgow and Edinburgh. An English clergyman in 1689 noted that lowland women still frequently wore tartan. In 1703, author Martin Martin described regional distinctions in tartan pattern. In the 1718 poem Tartana, Alan Ramsay refers to tartans being worn that were given the names of prominent lowland families. The humble Ayrshire farmer Robert Burns, though not a Highlander, was remembered by his friends for wearing, quote, a checked plaid around his shoulders. This was probably the shepherd tartan, a simple black and white check described as the traditional tartan of the Scottish borders. As far as Macaulay's claim that the Highlands were an uncivilized nation, here he does slightly contradict himself. He, quote, here and there at the castle of some great lord who had a seat in the Parliament and Privy Council, and who was accustomed to pass a great large part of his life in the cities of the south, might have been found wigs and embroidered coats, plate and fine linen, lace and jewels, French dishes and French wines. Macaulay is suggesting this is exceptional. In reality, everywhere in the Highlands had at the top of its local society a clan chief, and these clan chiefs were almost always local landowners and politicians. If they themselves were not an aristocrat, they would fall under the power of a larger clan chief who was. All the Highlands' great aristocrats were clan chiefs. Members of these dynasties patronized the leading architects, artists, scholars, artisans, and intellectuals of their day, had frequently been educated abroad and taken the grand tour of Europe. And in that print, you can see what was then Gordon Castle. Highland aristocrats and chiefs were often at the centre of a network of educated Highlanders who went on to become lawyers, scholars, officers of state, privy councillors, and military leaders. Men from Highland backgrounds could rise through the system thanks to the education of the Church of Scotland's parish schools. Here is a portrait from the Signet Library of Highland-born George Dallas, a lawyer and writer to the Signet, who rose to become Deputy Keeper of the Privy Seal in 1660. Dallas was the author of the first systematic work of styles, that is, templates, of Scottish legal documents, contributing to the professionalisation of legal practice. As you can see, the work is dedicated to another Highlander, John, Earl of Tullibardine. So we have two Highlanders responsible for one of the most important works in the development of one of the pillars of Scottish national identity, the legal system. Men like Dallas hardly conform to Macaulay's portrait of a Highlander as, quote, a filthy, abject savage. You only have to look at the story of Macaulay's own family, And let me tell you, I have studied a lot of Scots in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the Macaulays were a classic example of a Highland family networking in Britain and the Empire. Macaulay himself doesn't seem to see this. For several generations, Macaulay men had benefited from the education system in Scotland on Calvinist principles. Zachary's father was a Church of Scotland minister, as his father and grandfather had been before him. So from his father, his sisters, his uncles and aunts, his family clan, Macaulay derived his self-confidence and his connections. Why did Macaulay write so negatively about Scotland? It was something noted and commented upon in Scotland at the time of that his history first appeared. In a pamphlet in the Signet Library's collections, Macaulay on Scotland, a Critique, his contemporary Thomas Macrie found Macaulay guilty of, quote, willful and studied exaggeration. And this critique was syndicated in newspapers across Scotland in 1856, three of which are shown there on the slide. Another author, John Paget, an English barrister, accused Macaulay of, quote, a parricidal onslaught by a son of the Highlands on the people and the land of his fathers. I mentioned how inaccurately Macaulay used John Mackie's journey through Scotland, and Paget comprehensively demolished Macaulay's creative use of other sources. He shows that Macaulay suppressed positive observations about Scotland and projected his own views onto others. However, such critiques counted for little under the onslaught of the publishing phenomenon of Macaulay's history. Even when Macaulay is complimentary about Scots, it's backhanded, such as Scottish patriotism being, quote, exhibited often in heroic and sometimes in a comic form. Why comic? Attitudes to national identity start with an individual's own family, and Macaulay exemplifies this. He seems to have felt more at home with his maternal family's English cultural identity. It was a time, of course, that assumed the superiority of English culture. As a young woman, his Macaulay Aunt Jean was educated by her prospective English in-laws to lose her Scottish accent and manners. For Macaulay, England and its post-Glorious Revolution constitution were both exceptional and exemplary in the march of progress. He bristled, quote, where the Highlands were concerned, men of sense gave ready credence to stories without evidence, and men of taste gave rapturous applause to compositions without merit. Macaulay's disdain for a popular fashion, booming thanks to Victorian consumerism and new methods of production, appears something deeply personal. It seems natural that when huge numbers of Highlanders moved across the empire, there should follow a human desire to memorialize and sentimentalize that culture. But, in the words of a contemporary critic, quote, Mr. Macaulay scarcely touches the human heart. Macaulay never married. His sisters and their families were his closest companions. For whatever reason, the Highlands of Scotland, from which his own clan originated, had no place in his heart. At a time when many of his contemporaries were celebrating their Scottish heritage, Macaulay wanted to make them seem ridiculous, to trivialise an ethnocultural identity and permanently taint Scottish national identity with the slur of fabrication. So why did I choose the title No True Scotsman? It's a play on the linguistic fallacy of that name. The fallacy is when a counter instance of a claim is dismissed as not a true representation of that claim. Now that sounds hard to follow, so I'll give you an example. Person A states that no Scotsman is a coward. Person B responds that Hamish McSwiggan, a well-known Scotsman, is famous for running away at the first sight of danger. Person A responds, but no true Scotsman is a coward. I leave you to decide if Macaulay was a true Scotsman, but he is a fascinating subject of study. His success was due to his intellect, yet he is sometimes a mass of contradictions. His sense of Anglo-intellectual superiority was perhaps so overwhelming that it denied him the emotional connection with Scotland that might have allowed him to give a more balanced and sympathetic account of Scottish national identity. Without an empathetic understanding of others, no historian can truly explain to their readers national identity and the deep love people can feel for a nation, a country, a home, or an idea. Macaulay's instinctive reaction to these feelings was to ridicule, trivialise, and misrepresent the forces that shaped the Scottish nation. As one contemporary Scottish critic put it, quote, "Macaulay is the Dickens of historians, without the wide and warm heart of the novelist." Thank you for listening, and thank you for your donations, which will go to the Signet Library and its collections. The Signet Library is an Enlightenment jewel in the heart of Macaulay's old constituency of Edinburgh, so hopefully his lordship would approve. Completed at the beginning of the 19th century, the Signet Library is an architectural wonder that holds incredible collections of books, some very rare indeed, some of which I've used for this talk, journals, newspapers, pamphlets, manuscripts, and paintings. We make all these available for researchers to use. So thank you again for listening and for your donations.